That feeling, the sense that the old world is dying and something new is being born. It's not new. It's happened before. 7 times before, actually. Right now, tonight, wherever you are. Maybe lying in the dark, the news still running somewhere in your mind. A half-formed worry about the economy, about politics, about the institutions that used to feel solid. You are not the first person to feel this way. Not even close. Here's what most people don't realize about this feeling. This particular flavor of unease. This sense that something fundamental is shifting. It is one of the most documented psychological experiences in all of human history. Every single civilization that has ever risen to global dominance has eventually felt it, has lived inside it, has passed through it. 7 times before, in the archaeological and historical record, a civilization has reached this exact point. The point where you are sitting right now. Felt what you are feeling. And something new, something we couldn't predict and couldn't plan for, emerged from the other side. Tonight, we trace every single one. The pattern isn't just fascinating, it's a map, and you're already on it. If you're using this to fall asleep tonight, that's exactly why I make these. Maybe subscribe if this is the kind of thing you find yourself returning to. And let me know where you are and what time it is, because right now, somewhere in the world, it's Tokyo at dawn, it's Toronto just past midnight, it's Sydney winding down, it's London in the small hours, it's California at 3 a.m. Every single one of you in a different moment, but all of you here, in the dark, together. And if you're lying awake tonight, turning things over in your mind, the news, the economy, that sense that something fundamental is shifting, you're not imagining it. Tonight, we're going to give that feeling a map, because this feeling has a name, and it has happened before. So, settle in, get comfortable, let this be the thing that carries you tonight. We're going to travel through 5,000 years of history, through the rise and fall and rise again of everything human beings have ever built. And by the end of it, I think you'll sleep a little easier. Not because the world isn't changing, but because you'll understand something about how it changes. Here's the thing that historians don't usually tell you. History doesn't move in a straight line. We think it does, we were taught that it does. We learned this idea in school, absorbed it from documentaries and textbooks and the general story of civilization, that humanity starts somewhere primitive and gradually, steadily improves. More knowledge, better technology, more freedom, more prosperity, an escalator moving upward 1 generation at a time. Except that's not how it works. Not at all. What actually happens, what the historical record actually shows, when you step back far enough to see it, is something stranger, and in some ways, more beautiful. Civilizations don't build on each other. They rise, they dominate, they collapse completely, and from the ruins something entirely new emerges. Not a continuation, not an improvement, a replacement. The Rome you think you know, it was one empire within one civilization, the classical civilization, not the civilization itself. When Rome fell, it felt like the end of everything. To the people living through it, it was. But it wasn't the end of civilizational development. It was the end of one chapter and the slow, terrifying, beautiful beginning of another. Here's a definition that might help. A civilization isn't a government, it isn't a country, it isn't even a culture in the way we normally use that word. A civilization is a complete view, a shared story so powerful, so deeply embedded, that it binds millions of people together, across centuries, across languages, across wars, across generations without any single authority forcing them to believe it. It's the water the fish swims in. It's the invisible framework that makes everything else feel normal. When you wake up tomorrow morning and assume without questioning that your vote has value, that science is a reliable way to understand the world, that individual rights exist and matter, that the future is something to be built rather than merely endured, you are breathing the air of a particular civilization, Western civilization, the 7th. And here's the thing that starts to feel unsettling when you look at the pattern. Every single civilization before this one believed something similar, that its values were self-evident, that its way of organizing life was just correct, natural, inevitable. Every single one of them was eventually replaced. But here's where the story gets more complex and more interesting. Replaced doesn't mean destroyed. It doesn't mean the people disappeared. It doesn't mean the art was worthless or the philosophy was wrong. It means the invisible framework, the shared story, the deep assumptions about what reality is and how to live in it, that framework, eventually lost its animating force, its explanatory power, its ability to make people feel that participating in the civilization was worth it. And when enough people stopped believing, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, quietly, the way air leaks from a tire, the civilization began its transition. Which brings us to a question that historians have been wrestling with for over a century. Is there a pattern? Is there a shape to how civilizations move through time? And if so, what stage are we in? A German philosopher sitting in a rented room in 1918 thought he had the answer. And what he wrote before 2 world wars, before the atomic bomb, before everything that defines the modern world should stop you cold. Oswald Spengler was an obscure German schoolteacher, a man who had largely failed to get a university position, who lived alone in Munich, who had spent over a decade working on a book that no serious historian thought would amount to much. In 1918, The Decline of the West was published. It became one of the most discussed books of the 20th century. Spengler's central claim was this: civilizations are not inventions. They are organisms. They are born. They grow. They mature. They age. They die. And they do this on a roughly 1,000-year timescale, moving through 4 distinct seasons: spring, summer, autumn, and winter, just as reliably as a human being moves from childhood through old age. The Western civilization, he argued, had entered its winter. Here's what makes this extraordinary, and what should genuinely stop you for a moment. Spengler finished writing The Decline of the West in 1918. The First World War had just ended, and most of the world was so traumatized, so desperate to believe that things would recover and return to normal, that almost nobody wanted to hear what he was saying. But Spengler didn't flinch. He described in clinical detail the trajectory of a civilization in its terminal phase, the rise of plutocracy over genuine democracy, the replacement of authentic culture with entertainment, the emergence of Caesarism, strongman politics as exhausted democracies prove unable to solve basic problems, the spiritual emptiness at the center of a civilization that had once been able to build cathedrals. He wrote all of this in 1918, before Hitler, before the Second World War, before the atomic age, before the television era, before social media, before everything we assume defines our moment. And I want to say something here because we're going to move through some big, dense ideas tonight. Spengler himself wrote over 800 pages about this. Toynbee wrote 12 volumes. Tonight, we're going to take what matters from each of them and leave the rest behind. You don't need to hold all of this. Just let it wash over you. The pattern will emerge on its own. Now, Spengler wasn't alone. In fact, his work sparked a generation of thinkers who tried to map the same territory. Arnold Toynbee, a British historian who spent 40 years producing what is probably the most comprehensive analysis of civilizational cycles ever written, agreed with the basic premise, but added something crucial. Civilizations don't die because they're conquered, Toynbee argued. They die from within. Specifically, they die when the creative minority, the small group whose energy, vision, and moral authority originally built the civilization, transforms into a dominant minority, a group that no longer leads by inspiration but rules by force. The creative minority that had led the civilization's growth becomes a dominant minority that rules through force rather than inspiration. The majority withdraws its allegiance. Think about that for a moment. Withdraws its allegiance, not through revolution necessarily, not through dramatic uprising, just quietly stops believing, stops feeling that the civilization's story is their story, stops participating in good faith. When was the last time you felt that the institutions around you were led by people who had earned genuine moral authority rather than simply held power? Beyond Spengler and Toynbee, other thinkers mapped the same territory from different angles. Samuel Huntington saw civilizational identity as the organizing principle of post-Cold War conflict, the clash of civilizations that has shaped so much of 21st century geopolitics. The political scientist Carol Quigley identified 7 distinct stages in a civilization's life cycle mixture: gestation, expansion, age of conflict, universal empire, decay, and invasion. The sociologist Pitirim Sorokin tracked what he called cultural supersystems, oscillations between ideational cultures focused on spirit and meaning, and sensate cultures focused on pleasure and the material world, each lasting roughly 500 years before flipping to the other. Different frameworks, different vocabularies, but the same underlying observation. There is a shape to civilizational time, a pattern, a rhythm. Picture this for a moment. It's 1918. A young man in Germany, maybe a student, maybe a school teacher, has just gotten hold of a copy of Spengler's book. He's reading it by lamplight in a rented apartment. The war is just over. The streets outside are exhausted. The old world, the world of the Kaiser, of European empires, of confident industrial civilization, feels shaken but somehow still intact. Surely, he thinks, it will recover. Surely things will return to normal. He reads Spengler's diagnosis. The winter of Western civilization, the age of Caesarism, the gradual replacement of culture with mere entertainment, the spiritual emptiness at the center. He closes the book. Neither world war had happened yet. The Holocaust was 25 years in the future. The Cold War was 30 years away. The atomic bomb was 27 years from the moment his hand rested on that cover. He didn't know that yet. The question Spengler raised, was he describing a universal law, or was he simply a pessimist who got lucky, is the question that 100 years of history has been answering, whether we wanted it to or not. To understand the answer, we need to look at the evidence, not just one civilization, all 7. Let's go back, way back, not to one beginning to 7 of them. The first civilization we can document with reasonable certainty is Sumer, the river civilization of ancient Mesopotamia, in what is now southern Iraq. Around 3500 BCE, something happened that archaeologists still find startling. Writing appeared. Not slowly, not experimentally over generations, but suddenly, almost fully formed, within a remarkably short time. The Sumerians themselves, when they tried to explain it, said they hadn't invented it. The god Enki had given it to them. Imagine the sound of it, the sharp, percussive scratch of a stylus pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay in a room that smelled of river mud and lamp oil, recording the first human thoughts anyone thought worth keeping. Here's the thing about this civilization. It laid the foundations of almost everything we consider civilization. Writing, mathematics, legal codes, astronomy, urban planning, long-distance trade, and then it vanished. Not conquered so much as absorbed, transformed, eventually forgotten. For millennia, its very existence was lost. We only began to uncover it in the 19th century. Ancient Egypt is the second, and Egypt is, in some ways, the most mysterious because the oldest parts of it remain the most technically impressive. The water erosion patterns on the Sphinx suggest it may be thousands of years older than we officially date it, possibly predating the Egypt we normally talk about by several thousand years. The precision of the Great Pyramid, its alignment to true north to within 1/20th of a degree, achievable today only with satellite technology, implies a level of mathematical and engineering sophistication that raises questions we still cannot fully answer. Picture the desert at dawn, the limestone still cold from the night, the smell of dry stone and papyrus on the air, the sound of the Nile running somewhere beyond the construction site, while something is being built that will outlast every empire that follows it by thousands of years. The Indus Valley civilization, centered in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, flourishing around 2600, 1900 BCE, is perhaps the most puzzling of all. This was a sophisticated urban civilization, planned cities with standardized street grids, advanced sewage systems, uniform weights and measures suggesting economic integration across hundreds of miles. It was, in its time, arguably the most technically accomplished civilization on Earth. And then, around 1900 BCE, it simply stopped, not destroyed by invasion, not decimated by climate. The cities were abandoned, the people dispersed. Not a catastrophe, more like a collective decision to walk away. The silence of an abandoned city wind through empty streets where children once played. the faint smell of old cooking fires still embedded in mud brick walls, and not a single person left to explain why they left. Ancient China is the fourth civilization, and the exception that makes the pattern more interesting rather than less. Chinese civilization represents the only example of genuine unbroken continuity across 4,000 years. It has absorbed conquerors, transformed invaders, survived revolutions that would have destroyed anything else. The writing system connects a modern Chinese university student to texts written 3,500 years ago in a way that no other civilization can match. The deep resonance of a bronze bell struck in a temple that has stood for 1,000 years still vibrating in the air long after the monk has stepped away, in a silence that feels like it stretches all the way back to the beginning. Mesoamerica, the civilization of the Maya, the Aztec, and their predecessors, developed independently of the Old World and arrived at stunning sophistication entirely on its own terms. The Maya independently invented zero. They built astronomical observatories capable of predicting celestial events millennia in advance. Their calendar system, so often misrepresented in popular culture, was a genuine mathematical achievement of the first order. The smell of copal smoke rising into a clear night sky from a stone observatory platform, while astronomers track the movement of Venus with an accuracy that modern telescopes, centuries later, would confirm as essentially correct. Classical civilization, the civilization of Greece and Rome, is the one most Westerners know best, and still manage to misunderstand. Rome was not a civilization. Rome was an empire, a political structure within a larger civilizational framework that included Greek philosophy, Mediterranean religion, Roman law, and a shared culture stretching from Britain to Syria. When Rome fell, it felt like the end of everything. To the people living through it, it was. But the classical civilization had been weakening long before Rome's walls were breached. And here is something that genuinely stops modern engineers cold. Roman concrete, particularly the hydraulic concrete used in harbours and marine structures, is more durable than any concrete currently produced. We have not yet fully reverse-engineered it. They knew something we forgot. The smell of salt water and volcanic ash in a Roman harbour at dawn, the weight of pozzolana concrete setting slowly in the seawater, binding itself into something that will still be standing 2,000 years later, while everything built around it has long since crumbled. Which brings us to Western civilization, the seventh. Born from the ruins of Rome, gestated through medieval Christianity, turbocharged by the scientific revolution and the industrial age. Western civilization made the modern world its assumptions about individual rights, scientific progress, democratic governance, and secular meaning-making are so thoroughly woven into our daily lives that most of us simply cannot see them. They are the water we swim in. Here's a scale comparison that puts all of this into perspective. Cleopatra lived closer in time to the iPhone than to the building of the Great Pyramid. The pyramid was built around 2560 BCE. Cleopatra died in 30 BCE, roughly 2,500 years after the pyramid was built. The iPhone was released in 2007, roughly 2,000 years after Cleopatra died. She was, in other words, closer in time to us than to the builders of what she herself considered ancient monuments. 5,000 years of civilizational development, 7 distinct civilizations, and the pattern across all of them, when you lay them side by side, is something that stops you cold. Each one, at its cultural peak, believed it was unique, special, exempt from the cycle that had destroyed the others. The Romans were certain that the Senate and people of Rome, SPQR, would endure forever. The Song Dynasty scholars were confident that Chinese civilization, with its unbroken continuity, had transcended the barbarism that crushed lesser cultures. The high medieval thinkers of Western Europe believed they were building the kingdom of God on earth, a civilization that would last until the end of time. Every single one of them was wrong, not about the value of what they built, not about the beauty of what they created, but about the exemption. Here's the thing. Every civilization in this survey, at its height, was producing art and philosophy and technology that was genuine and remarkable. And every single one, at some point, stopped being animated by whatever force had originally driven it. The creative energy shifted. The story that had bound everyone together began to feel hollow, particularly to the people who were supposed to believe it most fervently. And then, slowly, over decades and sometimes centuries, the winter began. The question that Spengler and Toynbee were really asking wasn't, will this civilization end? The historical record answers that question clearly enough. The question they were asking, the question we need to ask tonight is, what season are we in? Spengler had a name for it. He called it winter, and it wasn't a metaphor chosen for drama. It was a precise diagnosis, the result of mapping 800 years of Western history against the same four-phase arc he had found in every civilization before it. Here's the thing about the four seasons, and this is where the model stops being abstract and starts feeling uncomfortably familiar. Spring, he said, was the early medieval period. Not the barbarism we imagine when we picture the so-called Dark Ages, but something vivid and alive. A civilization just finding its creative energy, its animating myth. The cathedral builders of the 12th and 13th centuries, men who would spend 40 years on a structure they would never see completed, were not doing architecture. They were doing theology in stone. They believed, with a certainty that would be incomprehensible to us today, that the building mattered, that the act of construction was an act of spiritual participation in something infinite. Summer arrived with the Renaissance, the civilization maturing, discovering the world, translating its spiritual energy into philosophy and art and science. The 15th and 16th centuries, Copernicus, Michelangelo, Machiavelli, the world grew larger. The assumptions of spring began to soften, but the creative energy was still magnificent, still generative. There was still something to believe in. Now it was just man as well as God. Autumn came with the Enlightenment, the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. This is where Spengler saw the highest cultural expression of Western civilization, the great symphonies, the great novels, the great philosophical systems, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, the civilization at its intellectual peak. But also, and here's where it gets interesting, the first deep internal contradictions, the first signs that the animating story was beginning to fracture. The Enlightenment's promise was that reason could replace religion as the civilizational glue, that science and individual rights and democratic governance could hold a civilization together as well as any cathedral. For roughly 2 centuries, that seemed to be working. And then autumn turned to winter. Spengler's winter. Our moment is not a sudden crisis. It doesn't arrive like a conquering army. It arrives like a slow change in the quality of light, a gradual cooling, a loss of animating force that is almost invisible until you step back far enough to see it. Here's what winter looks like, according to Spengler's diagnosis. The spiritual impulse that once built cathedrals becomes materialism. Art turns inward and self-referential, endlessly commenting on itself, obsessed with irony and deconstruction, unable to produce the kind of work that made previous generations weep or fall on their knees. Democracy. The political expression of summer and autumn becomes hollowed out. Real power migrates from elected governments to concentrated wealth. Spengler called it plutocracy. The people who run the financial systems of the civilization exercise more power over daily life than the people who run the governments. Cities swell. Rural areas empty. The atomized individual cut off from family, from tradition, from the extended community structures that gave earlier generations their identity, becomes the basic unit of civilization. Not the family, not the guild, not the community. The individual, alone, in an apartment, consuming content. Politics becomes theatre. Genuine statesmanship, the ability to lead by moral authority, to inspire genuine belief in the civilizational project, becomes rare. What replaces it is management of spectacle. Parties that have forgotten what they stand for, recycling the same crises decade after decade, unable to solve basic problems that earlier generations would have considered straightforward. And from the exhaustion of that theatrical democracy, Spengler said, something else emerges. He called it Caesarism. Strongmen. Not necessarily cruel, sometimes genuinely popular, genuinely capable, but the rise of the strongman is the sign that the civilization's democratic machinery has lost its self-belief. He wrote all of this in 1918. Every single thing he described, the plutocracy, the hollowing of democracy, the atomized city dweller, the theatre of politics, the loss of genuine artistic vision, the yearning for a Caesarist figure to cut through the noise he described, before any of it had reached the scale we take for granted today. before television, before the internet. Before social media created a planet of atomized individuals alone in their rooms consuming content at 2 a.m., the civilization that once built cathedrals and conquered continents becomes cautious, risk-averse, obsessed with comfort and safety. Not because the people are weaker, not because the culture has collapsed, but because the animating spirit, the story that once made people willing to spend 40 years on a building they'd never see finished, that spirit has gone quiet. And here's what Spengler was careful to emphasize, because this is where most people misread him. Winter is not the end. It is a phase. Rome persisted for centuries after its vital spirit was gone. The Western Roman Empire functioned trade, law, infrastructure, for 200 years after most serious thinkers had diagnosed its spiritual death. A civilization in winter is not a civilization in collapse. It is a civilization running on a kind of magnificent inertia. The libraries are still open. The roads still work. People are still falling in love and raising children and building things. But the animating myth, the shared story that once made everyone's sacrifice feel worth it, has gone quiet. And the people who feel that most acutely are the ones lying awake at 2 a.m., turning over the news, unable to name exactly what is wrong, but certain that something fundamental has shifted. That the world their parents inhabited operated on different assumptions than the world they're inheriting. You're not imagining it. That particular kind of sleeplessness, the civilizational insomnia, the 3 a.m. mind that won't stop processing Spengler, would have recognized it immediately. It is, in his model, one of winter's most reliable symptoms. Picture this. It's late. The city outside your window is still making its city sounds, distant traffic, the hum of the building's systems, a phone notification somewhere 2 floors up. You're lying awake, the blue light of a screen nearby, the news, on a loop, covering something that feels urgent and somehow also exactly like the news from 3 years ago. You scroll. You are one of approximately 8 billion people on this planet. You are living in what will one day be recognized as one of the most technologically sophisticated civilizations in the history of the species. And you cannot sleep. Spengler had a word for this. He wrote it down in 1918. But Spengler's winter diagnosis raised a question that a British historian named Arnold Toynbee spent his entire career trying to answer, and his answer was both darker and more hopeful than anything Spengler had imagined. Arnold Toynbee disagreed with Spengler about almost everything except the most important thing. He agreed that civilizations move through cycles. He agreed that something was profoundly wrong with the direction of Western civilization in the 20th century. But where Spengler saw a biological determinism, civilizations aging and dying like organisms, with no escape from the pattern Toynbee, saw something more complicated. And in that complication, something genuinely hopeful. Here's where Toynbee went somewhere most historians wouldn't follow him. Civilizations, he said, don't collapse because they grow old. They collapse when they stop being able to respond creatively to challenges. And the key word there is creatively. In Toynbee's model, every civilization begins with what he called a creative minority. A small group, not necessarily powerful, not necessarily wealthy, but visionary, whose energy and moral authority and sheer willingness to try something new pulls a larger society in a new direction. The original Christians gathering in catacombs under Rome, the early merchants of Florence financing artists and philosophers and creating the infrastructure for the Renaissance, the intellectual circle around Franklin and Jefferson and Hamilton, arguing late into the night about what a republic could be. These groups didn't rule by force. They led by inspiration. People followed them voluntarily, because what they were building seemed worth following. That voluntary participation, that sense that the civilization story is your story, is what Toynbee called allegiance. And he argued that civilizations don't die when they're conquered from outside. They die when the majority withdraws its allegiance. Not dramatically, not all at once, not in revolution necessarily, just quietly. A slow internal migration where more and more people stop believing that the civilization's project is their project, stop participating in good faith, stop feeling that the sacrifice required the taxes, the civic engagement, the following of rules that seem increasingly arbitrary is worth it. The creative minority, meanwhile, transforms. Sated by success, Threatened by challenge, it calcifies. It stops leading by inspiration and begins ruling by enforcement. It becomes, in Toynbee's phrase, a dominant minority. A group that once drew voluntary followers now demands compliance. The institutions that once solved problems now exist primarily to protect the interests of the people who run them. Can we still inspire people to believe, to voluntarily participate, to feel that our civilization story is their story? That was the question Toynbee thought mattered. When the answer becomes no, he said, the ending has already begun. Everything that follows the political crises, the economic disruptions, the military defeats, is just the visible expression of something that was already decided at a deeper level. When was the last time you felt that the institutions around you were led by people who had earned genuine moral authority rather than simply inherited power or bought influence? Toynbee called the people who had withdrawn their allegiance the internal proletariat. Not a Marxist term, he meant anyone, at any economic level, who no longer felt the civilization's success as their own success. The person who shows up to work but doesn't believe in what they're building. The voter who goes through the motions but expects nothing to change. The parent who can't explain to their child why the institutions they're inheriting deserve respect. And pressing inward from outside, from all the edges the civilization could no longer hold together was the external proletariat. The peoples and forces the civilization had once dominated or ignored, now finding the center too weak to resist them. Rome had both. Ancient China had both. Every civilization that has ever entered its terminal phase has had both. But here's what Toynbee saw that almost nobody else had noticed, and this is the part of his model that has stayed with me longer than any of the rest of it. 3 of the most profound spiritual innovations in human history emerged directly from civilizational breakdown, not despite the collapse, because of it. The first, Buddhism. Around 500 BCE, the Vedic civilization of northern India was in exactly the pattern Toynbee described. A dominant minority, the Brahmin priestly class ruling through ritual compliance rather than genuine spiritual inspiration. A majority withdrawing its allegiance from the official religion. A civilization that had solved the external challenges of its spring and summer and was now consuming itself in the luxury and rigidity of autumn. Into that breakdown walked a young nobleman named Siddhartha Gautama. He had every advantage the civilization could offer, and he walked away from it. Not into exile, but into the question that the civilization could no longer answer. Why does suffering exist, and what do we do with it? Buddhism emerged from the crack in the Vedic civilization. It took the wreckage of a collapsing spiritual framework and, from the pieces, built something that would eventually carry meaning to 1 billion people across Asia for 2,500 years. The second, Christianity. The Western Roman Empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD was Toynbee's model in perfect motion. The creative minority that had built Rome, the senatorial class, the early emperors, the civic-minded elite who genuinely believed in the Republic, had long since become a dominant minority, ruling by military force and bread and circuses. The internal proletariat was enormous. Millions of people, Roman citizens in name, who felt no connection to the Roman project. The external proletariat pressed inward from every border. Into that breakdown travelled a tent-maker from Tarsus named Paul, carrying letters about a Jewish teacher who had been executed by the Roman state. Those letters travelled along the roads the empire was already beginning to abandon. They found the people the civilization had already lost: the slaves, the dispossessed, the women without legal standing, the merchants on the margins. Christianity emerged from the dying body of the Roman Empire and became the animating myth of the next civilization that rose from its ruins. Not in spite of Rome's collapse, because of it. The collapse created the need, and someone answered it. The third, Islam. In 972 AD, 2 of the most powerful civilizations in the world, the Byzantine Empire in the west and the Sassanid Persian Empire in the east, had been at war with each other for so long that both were exhausted past recovery. Between them lay the Arabian Peninsula, peripheral and largely ignored, a gap between collapsing superpowers. Into that gap walked a merchant named Mohammed, alone on a mountain outside Mecca, and he came down with a revelation that would transform the next 1,000 years of human history. Islam filled the political and spiritual vacuum left by 2 civilizations too tired to hold their own territories. In a century, It had unified a region that neither great empire had been able to govern. 3 of the most transformative spiritual innovations in history. 3 civilizational collapses. 1 pattern. The collapse is not the end. It is the crack that lets the light in. Toynbee believed that when a civilization's dominant minority can no longer answer the deepest human questions about meaning, about suffering, about what makes sacrifice worth it, that spiritual vacuum is not simply destructive, it is the necessary condition for something entirely new. The old framework has to become genuinely unworkable before enough people are willing to build something different. Picture a small group of people. It doesn't matter when or where. It could be 15th century Florence. It could be Philadelphia in 1787. It could be a garage in California in 1975. They are gathered around a table, arguing. They believe something genuinely, viscerally believe it, that most of the people around them either don't understand or have already given up on. They are trying to build something. 2 generations later, their descendants are gathered in a boardroom. The original belief is still referenced. It appears in the logo, in the founding documents, in the ceremonial speeches, but the gathering now is about protecting what was built, managing what exists, keeping out the challengers. Nobody in the boardroom is lying. They have simply forgotten what the original group was for. That, Toynbee said, is how it always begins. But Toynbee, for all his insight, was working with historical cycles that moved across centuries. An American historian writing in 1997 decided to map the same pattern at a shorter, more human-scaled frequency, and what he found was something that should make you put down whatever you're doing for a moment. Spengler worked in centuries. Toynbee worked in centuries. Their models were useful for understanding the shape of civilizational time, but they didn't give you much that was actionable at the human scale, the scale of a single lifetime, or a generation, or a political era. 2 American historians decided to zoom in. William Strauss and Howe spent decades studying a pattern in American history that nobody else had noticed, or nobody had wanted to notice. What they found was a cycle roughly 80 to 100 years long, a cycle they called the saeculum, a Latin term meaning roughly the length of a long human life. The idea being that the full arc of the cycle requires approximately 3 or 4 generations to complete long, enough that the people who lived through the last turning of the wheel are all dead before it comes around again. Here's the thing about a cycle that's longer than living memory. Nobody alive has experienced it before. Every time it arrives with the feeling of complete novelty, as if this particular crisis, this particular breakdown of civic order, this particular sense that the institutions have failed and the centre cannot hold, is entirely unprecedented. But in the historical record it isn't. It just feels that way because the people who remember the last time are gone. The saeculum turns through 4 phases, each lasting roughly 20 years. Strauss and Howe called them the high, the awakening, the unravelling, and the crisis. The high follows every crisis. It is the era of institutional rebuilding. People who have been through collective trauma, war, depression, upheaval want order. They want safety. They trust institutions. They build them. In American history, the post-World War II decades are the great example. 1945 to the mid-1960s, a time of extraordinary institutional confidence in government, in business, in the idea of collective progress, the highways, the suburbs, the universities, the space program, a civilization reassembling itself after catastrophe. Then comes the awakening. The children of the high, raised in security and institutional confidence, rebel against it, not out of ingratitude, but out of spiritual restlessness. They have material comfort. They lack meaning. The 1960s and 1970s in America, civil rights, Vietnam protests, the counterculture, the search for personal authenticity, the institutions their parents built are challenged, not because they failed at their material tasks, but because the generation that inherited them found them spiritually hollow. The unravelling follows. Institutions are distrusted. Individual freedom expands. The civic bonds that held the high together are deliberately loosened. This is seen as liberation. Markets deregulate. Communities thin. The idea that shared sacrifice for collective institutions is worth it becomes harder to sustain. The 1980s and 1990s in America, the celebration of individual achievement, the financialization of everything, the gradual withdrawal from civic life into private consumption, and then inevitably, in Strauss and Howe's model The Crisis, the accumulated dysfunction of the unravelling reaches a threshold. Problems that were ignored or deferred for decades collide simultaneously. The institutions that were hollowed out through the unravelling suddenly need to function, and they cannot. Everything that was individually sensible becomes collectively catastrophic. Trust collapses. Polarization spikes. The sense that the normal rules no longer apply spreads from the margins to the centre. This pattern has appeared 3 times in American history, with a regularity that is frankly eerie once you've seen it. The Revolutionary Crisis, 1774 to 1794. A 20-year convulsion that ended with the founding of the United States. The Civil War Crisis, 1860 to 1868. A national breakdown that had been deferred for 80 years, finally arriving with catastrophic force. The Great Depression and World War II crisis, 1929 to 1945. The civilizational near-miss that produced the post-war high. Each crisis arrives approximately 80 years after the last one. Each follows an unravelling in which trust in institutions has eroded past a recoverable point. Each requires a level of collective sacrifice and institutional rebuilding that would have seemed impossible in the unravelling that preceded it. 80 years, the length of a long human life, long enough that the people who lived through the last crisis are dead before the next one arrives. In 1997, Strauss and Howe published a book called The Fourth Turning. In it, they predicted that the next crisis would begin somewhere between 2005 and 2025. They wrote this in 1997, before 9/11, before the 2008 financial crisis, before the political polarization of the 2010s, before the pandemic, before every development that now defines what we mean when we talk about the crisis of democratic institutions. They predicted it, not in vague, unfalsifiable terms, in specific structural terms. A period of roughly 20 years in which accumulated dysfunction would reach a threshold, trust would collapse, the normal rules would cease to function, and something they couldn't say what would demand resolution at a civilizational scale. Let that land. We are not in a bad patch. We are not waiting for things to return to normal. We are living inside the climactic phase of a cycle that has appeared 3 times before in American history, and which Spengler's and Toynbee's models suggest is happening simultaneously at the larger civilizational scale. The revolutionary generation didn't know how it would end either. They just knew it couldn't continue as it was. Bill Clinton was president. The Spice Girls were on the radio. The internet existed technically, but most people still connected through dial-up. Google was founded that year. Nobody had a smartphone. The word podcast didn't exist. The phrase social media didn't exist. And in that year, 2 American historians sat down and predicted, with structural precision, the world you are living in right now. They weren't psychics. They were pattern readers. The pattern was always there. They just looked at it long enough to see where it led. But maps require legends. And the legend for this particular map, the one that helps you understand what civilizational winter looks like, not in theory, but in lived, daily experience, requires a closer look at the symptoms. Because the closer you look, the more recognizable they become. Here's the thing about decline, and this is important, because it runs counter to everything we've been culturally conditioned to expect. Decline doesn't arrive like a disaster movie. There is no singular moment when the alarm sounds and everyone looks at each other and says, "This is it. This is the fall of the civilization." It arrives like normal life, getting just a little bit harder, a little bit stranger, year after year reliably. Spengler, Toynbee, Quigley, Sorokin, for all their differences, they converged on 4 categories of symptoms, 4 domains in which the terminal phase of a civilization makes itself visible, if you know what you're looking at. Let's start with the economic symptoms. Every civilization in its terminal phase undergoes currency debasement. The Roman denarius was 90% silver in the early empire, and 5% silver by the 3rd century. Not because Romans stopped caring about silver, but because the costs of maintaining the civilization were outrunning its productive capacity. The Byzantine gold solidus, legendary for its stability across 7 centuries, eventually gave way to debasement as the empire's fiscal stress became unmanageable. Chinese dynasties issued paper money with spectacular confidence and then watched it inflate into worthlessness. Debasement is not a policy. It is a symptom. It is what you do when the gap between what the civilization promises its citizens and what it can actually deliver becomes too wide to close through honest accounting. Alongside debasement, wealth concentration. In every civilization's terminal phase, the proportion of total wealth held by the top fraction of the population increases dramatically. This is not a modern observation. Plutarch noticed it in Rome, Toynbee documented it across civilizations, Quigley mapped it as a standard feature of every civilization's final stage. The creative minority, once it has crystallized into a dominant minority, accumulates resources in ways that accelerate the cycle. And infrastructure decay, the roads, the water systems, the public institutions that everyone uses and everyone assumes someone else is paying for, until they're not. Somewhere in the Roman Empire, around 350 AD, so roughly 80 years before the Western Empire formally ceases to exist, a merchant is travelling the Appian Way. The road is in reasonable condition. He pays his taxes, grumbles about the currency, notes that the garrison at the last way station seems smaller than it used to be. He stops at an inn. He eats. He does not think, I am living through the fall of a civilization. He thinks, the road is rougher this year than last year. The denarius buys less than it did. The army seems stretched thin. He goes to sleep. The social symptoms are subtler, and in some ways more significant. Declining birth rates, specifically among the dominant cultural groups, appear in every civilization's terminal phase. This is not a cause of decline, but a symptom of it. People stop having children at replacement rates when they stop believing in the future they'd be handing those children, when the civilization's story no longer makes the cost of family formation seem worth it. The loss of shared ritual, the ceremonies that had once gathered communities together, religious, civic, seasonal, become optional, then embarrassing, then forgotten. What replaces them is consumption, which is private by nature, entertainment, which requires no shared belief, the retreat into private worlds where the individual is sovereign and the community makes no demands, the replacement of we with they. The institutions that once belonged to everyone, the schools, the government, the civic organizations, become perceived as belonging to someone else, someone whose interests are not yours. This shift from our institutions to their institutions is Toynbee's withdrawal of allegiance, visible in everyday speech. A Roman family is having dinner. It's 350 AD. The father is a minor functionary in the provincial administration. The mother manages the household with the competence of someone running a small business, which she essentially is. The teenage son has no particular interest in serving in the legions, not because he's cowardly, but because the legions don't feel like his legions anymore. The grandmother remembers when things felt different, though she'd struggle to say exactly how. They eat, they talk about the market prices, they complain about the new governor. They are not aware that they are living through the fall of a civilization. They are just having dinner. That is what decline looks like, from the inside. The cultural symptoms. Art turns inward. Instead of reaching outward toward the transcendent, toward the future, toward some vision of what humanity could become, the art of a civilization in winter turns reflexive. It comments on itself. It deconstructs its own traditions. It becomes obsessed with irony, with subversion, with the demonstration that the old forms were naive or oppressive or simply insufficient. This is not without value. The deconstruction of exhausted forms is how culture clears space for what comes next. But it is a symptom, not a feature. When the most celebrated art of a civilization is primarily about the impossibility of art, something has shifted. The encyclopedic impulse. A civilization in its final phase tends to produce vast, comprehensive reference works, commentaries on earlier commentaries, anthologies of Golden Age achievements. The energy that once went into building the civilization is redirected into cataloguing it, into preservation, into the museum, the nostalgia for earlier Golden Ages. The The conviction that the best work, the best governance, the best architecture, the best culture happened in a previous era, not in our time, but in the time of our grandparents, or of Rome, or of the founders. You felt this, the sense that nothing being made right now will last, that the buildings being built are designed to be replaced in 40 years, that the music being released is engineered for this quarter's playlist and will be forgotten by next year, that the politicians in the room are reading from scripts written by consultants who are themselves reading from focus groups. Not because the people are bad, not because the talent is gone, because the animating spirit that once made people willing to spend 40 years on something they'd never finish, that spirit has gone quiet. You felt this. That feeling has a name. The political symptoms are the most visible, and therefore the most discussed even by people who have no framework for understanding what they're looking at. Institutional paralysis. The inability to solve problems that were entirely solvable 2 generations ago. Not because the solutions are unknown in many cases, the technical solutions are well understood, documented, available, but because the political will to implement them requires a level of civic trust and shared sacrifice that no longer exists. The institution can see the problem. It cannot act on what it sees. Legitimacy erosion. The feeling that the rules apply differently depending on who you are. That the people who run the institutions are using them primarily for private benefit. That the social contract, the unspoken agreement that makes civilization function, is being honoured by some groups and violated by others. The flourishing of conspiracy theories. Not because people have suddenly become credulous, but because conspiracy theories fill the explanatory vacuum left by institutions that have lost their credibility. When the official explanation for why things are the way they are no longer satisfies, people build their own explanations. And the rise of the strongman, promising to cut through the noise, to enforce the rules that have stopped being enforced, to restore the civic order that erosion has undermined. Spengler called this Caesarism. Toynbee called it the response to creative minority failure. Strauss and Howe saw it as one of the possible shapes of the crisis resolution. And here is the thing. You've felt this. Not just intellectually, you have felt this. The news that seems to recycle the same crises year after year. The institutions that can see the problems and cannot solve them. The sense that the normal rules no longer apply, and that the people who are supposed to apply them have either given up or are using that ambiguity for their own advantage. The exhaustion of caring about things that seem not to change. You've felt this. This is not new. This is not something wrong with you. This is not a failure of your generation, or your country, or your character. This is what winter feels like from the inside. Every single time. From the inside, decline rarely feels like a clean break. It feels like normal life getting just a little bit harder, a little bit stranger, year after year. The Roman family at dinner in 350 AD felt it too. But here's what the Roman family at dinner in 350 AD could not have known, and what we can see now, only because we have the full pattern in front of us. The winter is not the end of the story. It never has been. And what comes after winter, the interregnum, the Dark Age, the gap between civilizations, is one of the most misunderstood and, in some ways, most hopeful periods in all of human history. Picture this. It is the year 620 AD. You are Brother Ionis. You are 23 years old. You are in a scriptorium in the north of Italy, a place called Bobbio, founded 6 years ago by an Irish monk named Columbanus, who walked here from Burgundy carrying almost nothing except a determination to keep certain things alive. You are copying Virgil, line by careful line, quill on vellum. The smell is tallow candles, the cheap kind, slightly smoky, with a faint animal warmth underneath. Cold stone. The faint, sweet mustiness of dried herbs pressed between pages in a stack of manuscripts on the shelf to your left. Your feet are cold through your sandals. Your fingers have that particular wooden numbness of people who work with their hands in unheated rooms in the Italian winter. The rough wool of your habit catches on the edge of the table. You are writing, line by careful line. Outside these walls, the Western Roman Empire has been gone for 144 years. You don't think about that. It is not a live fact for you in the way it would be for us, a dramatic historical rupture. It is simply the shape of the world you were born into. The roads still exist mostly. Some of the cities still function, after a fashion. The Latin you are writing was written by a man who died 650 years before you were born, and it is, in your world, the language of learning and liturgy and law. You are copying it because it seems worth copying, because the abbot Columbanus believed that the words of Virgil and Cicero and Jerome contained something that should not be lost. You are not making a philosophical argument for preservation. You are just doing your work. Here's the thing Brother Ionas could not have known. Sitting in that cold scriptorium in 620 AD, the manuscripts he and his fellow monks were copying, the Virgil, the Cicero, the Pliny, would survive. They would survive the collapse of the Frankish kingdoms and the Viking raids and the Black Death. They would survive in monastery libraries scattered across Ireland and Scotland and northern Italy and Switzerland, tiny islands of continuity in a sea of disruption. And 700 years later, when a generation of Italian scholars began reaching into those monastery libraries and pulling out what had been preserved, it would touch off something called the Renaissance. He was preserving a civilization. He didn't know that. He was just doing his work, keeping something alive because it seemed worth keeping alive. That is what the interregnum looks like from the inside. We call the period between the fall of Rome and the rise of medieval European civilization the Dark Ages. It's a phrase that has fallen out of academic fashion. Historians prefer the neutral late antiquity or early medieval, but it captures something real about how the people living through it experienced it. A sense of dimming, of things becoming harder to hold on to, of the extraordinary infrastructure of the Roman world, the roads, the aqueducts, the legal codes, the libraries, the trade networks stretching from Britain to Babylon, gradually going quiet. Not all at once, not with a single catastrophic break, but piece by piece, town by town, generation by generation. A road that isn't repaired becomes a track that isn't maintained becomes a path that isn't walked becomes a field. And somewhere along that process, the people walking it stop remembering that it was once a road, stop knowing what a road was for, stop believing that roads are something people can build. But here's what the Dark Ages actually were. From the perspective of 700 years of subsequent history, they were clearing. The complexity of the Roman world had reached a threshold that its administrative and economic systems could no longer support. The weight of the empire, the legions, the bureaucracy, the infrastructure, the tribute system had become greater than the productive capacity of the civilization to maintain it. Not because the people were less capable than their grandparents, but because the system had become too rigid, too expensive, too complex to adapt. And so, it simplified. Brutally, painfully, over centuries, but it simplified. And in that simplification, in the clearing of the Roman world's exhausted complexity, something became possible that had not been possible before. The monasteries that Brother Ionas worked in were not just preservation engines, they were also incubation chambers, new ways of organizing communities, new relationships between labor and prayer and learning, new models of what a human settlement could look like, built not on the Roman template of tax and tribute, but on voluntary association and shared purpose. The seeds of the medieval world and through it, of everything that came after, were planted in the Dark Ages, not despite the collapse, in the space the collapse created. And maybe that's true for all of us, not just civilizations. The things we've lost personally, as a culture, as a species, they don't just disappear. They create space. They clear ground that was too crowded for anything new to grow. The relationship that ended, the version of yourself you had to let go, the way of doing things that stopped working, even though you kept trying to make it work. All of it clearing, all of it making room. Spengler saw the interregnum as the death of a civilization. Toynbee saw it as the seedbed of the next one. Both were right. What looks like death from inside the dying civilization looks like birth from the outside of the civilization being born. Brother Ionas, in his cold scriptorium in Bobbio, was in both places at once, the last keeper of one world, the first builder of the next. He didn't know it. He was just doing his work. But if the seventh civilization is in its winter, and the evidence, as we've traced tonight, suggests it is, then the question that naturally follows is this: where is the eighth? Here's the thing about this question. I want to be honest with you about the limits of what any of us can actually know. The eighth civilization, if it is already beginning to form, almost certainly cannot be seen clearly from inside the seventh. The early Christians gathering in Roman catacombs didn't know they were the seed of the next civilization's animating myth. The Irish monks copying manuscripts in cold stone scriptoria didn't know they were the preservation mechanism for an entire intellectual tradition. The early printers in Gutenberg's workshop didn't know they were building the infrastructure of a revolution that would eventually topple kingdoms. Every civilization looks ridiculous from the outside. At the beginning, every one of them is invisible until it isn't. So, what we can do, what is honest, is identify the candidates. The places and patterns where something that looks like a new animating framework might be gathering force. Not predict the winner, not declare a winner. Just look carefully at what's emerging the way an astronomer looks at the sky, not with certainty, but with instruments that are as good as we have. There are 3 candidates worth taking seriously. They are genuinely different from each other, and the pattern says only one of them will provide the animating myth for the civilization that follows ours, or possibly none of them, and something we haven't noticed yet. The first candidate is East Asia, and specifically China. Here's what makes this candidate genuinely remarkable, rather than merely powerful. It isn't new. It is, in the deepest sense, the oldest continuous civilizational tradition in the world, a culture that has maintained unbroken philosophical and cultural continuity across 4,000 years, that has absorbed conquerors and transformed them, that has survived more catastrophes than any other civilization and emerged each time recognizably itself. When a Chinese university student today reads the Analects of Confucius, they are reading a text composed approximately 2,500 years ago, in a writing system that with adaptations connects directly to the one they learned in childhood. There is no equivalent experience available in any Western language. The English speaker cannot read Beowulf without a dictionary. The Chinese reader can read Confucius. This is not a political observation. It's a civilizational one. A culture that can maintain that depth of continuity carries a different kind of institutional memory than anything the modern West has managed to build. It thinks in centuries. Its planning horizons are genuinely long, and in a world facing civilizational scale challenges, the kind that require long-term thinking rather than electoral cycle thinking, that may be exactly the kind of resource that matters. The question, of course, is whether East Asia will provide the animating myth that a new global civilization requires, not just a powerful governance model, but a story compelling enough to draw voluntary allegiance from billions, from people who are not Chinese, not Confucian, not historically embedded in that tradition. History says it's possible. Islam did it. Christianity did it. Buddhism did it. All 3 emerged from specific cultural contexts and found universal resonance. Whether the East Asian tradition has a comparable universalist dimension is the question nobody can answer tonight. The second candidate is something more speculative and more geographically diffuse. Call it the Eurasian synthesis, the civilizational scaffolding that is being built, slowly, through the infrastructure of connection rather than the infrastructure of power. The Belt and Road Initiative, however you evaluate it politically, is, in structural terms, the largest single infrastructure project in human history. Roads, ports, railways, pipelines, and fibre-optic cables connecting 60-plus countries across Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. More miles of connection than Rome built in 5 centuries, completed in decades. But here's the thing about infrastructure. Every civilization we've studied tonight was held together by infrastructure. Roman roads, Islamic trade routes, Mongol postal systems, colonial shipping lanes. The infrastructure comes first. The culture follows. The story that binds the infrastructure into a civilization that gives it a shared identity, a shared meaning, a reason for people from different backgrounds to feel they are building something together. That story emerges later. The Eurasian synthesis is currently infrastructure without animating myth. Roads and cables and ports. Whether it generates a civilization, a shared story compelling enough to draw voluntary allegiance, depends on whether someone eventually finds the right words for what all of that connection is actually for. It has happened before. In the gap between 2 collapsing superpowers, a merchant from Mecca came down from a mountain with a revelation. In the ruins of the Western Roman Empire, A tent maker from Tarsus wrote letters that travelled the roads the empire was already abandoning. Infrastructure creates the possibility. The myth creates the civilization. The third candidate is the strangest, and in some ways the most interesting. Call it the cloud civilization, and by that I mean something very specific. Not the internet, not social media, but something that the internet has made possible. Communities organized not by geography, but by shared values, shared platforms, shared languages that have nothing to do with national origin. A gamer in Jakarta, a gamer in Toronto, a gamer in Lagos, connected by a shared aesthetic, a shared vocabulary, a shared set of stories. They may have more in common with each other than with their immediate neighbours. A programmer in Estonia, a programmer in Nairobi, a programmer in Bangalore, working on the same open source project, sharing the same philosophy about how code should be written. They are building something that looks, if you squint at it the right way, like the early infrastructure of a civilizational identity. Just as a single band of 30 humans in the evolutionary bottleneck didn't look like the future of the species, but connected to the right migration routes, exchanging knowledge at the right speed, they laid the foundations for everything that followed. The scattered nodes of the cloud civilization may be building something we cannot yet name, and perhaps, just perhaps, the person lying awake right now, somewhere on this planet, listening to a stranger's voice in the dark, connected to thousands of others doing the same thing in different time zones, each of them carrying the same anxiety, the same wonder, the same inability to sleep in a civilization that feels like it's changing underneath their feet. Perhaps that too is part of the pattern, a quiet, invisible thread being woven in the dark. You are not observing the transition. You are inside it. Right now, in the dark, you are one of the nodes. We don't know where the eighth civilization will come from. We don't know when. The pattern says, somewhere, someone is doing the work of preservation and creation that looks, from the outside, like just doing their work. Just keeping something alive because it seems worth keeping alive. The pattern says, it has always begun this way, but the eighth civilization, whatever it turns out to be, will be defined by something no previous civilization has ever had to navigate. A technology that doesn't just record ideas, but begins to process them. And that changes everything about the pattern we've been tracing tonight. Picture this. It's sometime in the 4th century AD. A young man named Augustine of Hippo, brilliant, restless, morally exhausted by his own complexity, is sitting in a garden in Milan. He has been struggling for years with the question of what to believe, what to commit his life to. He hears a child's voice from somewhere nearby, chanting, "Take up and read, take up and read." He picks up a text that is lying beside him. He reads a passage from Paul, and something he would later say was poured into his heart. He did not know, in that moment in the garden, that he was about to become one of the most influential thinkers in the history of Western civilization. He was just a man who couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking, couldn't find peace. That's how it begins. Every civilization we've looked at tonight was defined at its core by how it stored and transmitted information. Here's what's really interesting about that, and this is the thread that connects everything from Sumer to the present moment more directly than any political theory or economic model. Civilizations don't just use information, they are information systems. The animating myth that binds millions of people together across centuries is, at its most fundamental level, a very sophisticated information architecture, a set of shared stories, symbols, and values that have been encoded, transmitted, preserved, and updated across generations. Change the information technology, and you change the civilization. The first great information revolution happened approximately 5,000 years ago in southern Mesopotamia. Writing. Before writing, everything a civilization knew was held in living human minds. Oral traditions, passed from generation to generation by memory. The constraint was the human lifespan. You couldn't store more than a brilliant mind could memorize, and you couldn't transmit faster than a traveler could walk. Writing broke both constraints simultaneously. For the first time, information could outlast the person who held it. Knowledge could be stored outside of a human body, in clay, in papyrus, in stone, and retrieved by anyone who could read. Large, stable, hierarchical societies became possible for the first time in human history because now you could administer them. You could write down laws. You could record contracts. And 27. You could send instructions across hundreds of miles and have them arrive exactly as written. Every civilization we've examined tonight was built on writing. The Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Chinese, the Maya, all made the same discovery independently and arrived at the same result. Writing is civilization's first truly universal technology. The second revolution happened approximately 500 years ago, and it was more destabilizing than the first. The printing press. Before Gutenberg, a single book could take a monk years to copy by hand. Information moved slowly, expensively, through bottlenecks controlled by whoever owned the scriptoria, the monasteries, the universities, the royal courts. Literacy was restricted. Knowledge was hierarchical. The people at the top of the information system were the people at the top of the political system, and this was not a coincidence. Gutenberg's press could produce, in a day, what a monk could produce in a year. Within 50 years, millions of books were circulating across Europe. Information was no longer scarce. It couldn't be controlled. It moved like a virus. The result was one of the most turbulent centuries in Western history. The Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the wars of religion, the scientific revolution, the gradual emergence of secular political authority from the wreckage of religious monopoly on legitimate knowledge. The printing press didn't create stability, it created chaos, and from that chaos, eventually, a new order. But the chaos came first. The old information gatekeepers, the church, the nobility, the guilds of scribes, lost their monopoly on what counted as legitimate knowledge, and when that happened, the political structures built on that monopoly began to shake. Picture this. It's 1,456 inches, Mainz, Germany. Johann Gutenberg has just finished producing 200 copies of the Bible on his new press. He has some vague sense that this machine might sell well. He has no idea that within 50 years, his press will produce 10 million books across Europe, more than the entire preceding 1,000 years combined. He doesn't know about the Reformation. He doesn't know about the scientific revolution. He just knows he built something that makes books faster than monks. Here's what the pattern tells us about the third revolution, the one we are living through right now. Digital technology has done to information what the printing press did, squared and then cubed. The cost of copying information has approached zero. The cost of distributing information globally has approached zero. The speed of transmission has approached instantaneous. A single person with a laptop can reach more people in a day than Gutenberg could have reached in a lifetime. But the third revolution has one additional feature that neither writing nor the printing press possessed: artificial intelligence. Writing, recorded language. The printing press replicated it. Both technologies were passive. They stored and transmitted what human minds had already created. The information was always, ultimately, generated by human intelligence and simply preserved and distributed by technology. What AI does, what it is beginning to do, in ways that are still unfolding, is different in kind, not just degree. For the first time, the information technology is not merely recording and transmitting human thought, it is processing it, generating new combinations, deriving conclusions, writing, composing, designing, modeling. The quiet, invisible hum of servers in a cooled room, thousands of them, running cold, running constant processing in a fraction of a second what would take a human lifetime to think through. For the first time, something that is not human is potentially participating in the authorship of civilizational ideas. Picture this: your phone screen, glowing blue in the dark, quietly building a model of your psychology with every scroll. The light is cold. The room is quiet. Somewhere in a server farm you'll never see cooled to near freezing. Humming with electricity, something is listening, something is learning. Here are the two competing interpretations of what this means, and I'm not going to tell you which one is right, because I genuinely don't know, and I don't think anyone does. The first interpretation is what some call the global brain hypothesis. The argument is this: every previous civilization was cognitively limited by what human minds alone could process. We could only solve problems that fit inside the constraints of human thinking, human memory, human attention spans, human biases. AI extends those constraints dramatically. Search engines have already become a kind of collective memory storing what the civilization knows, making it retrievable by anyone. AI is now becoming a kind of collective reasoning apparatus, not replacing human judgment, but extending it the way a telescope extends human sight. The global brain optimists believe we are building the cognitive infrastructure for a leap in collective problem-solving capacity that could dwarf anything previous civilizations achieved. The second interpretation is darker. The same technology that might function as a cognitive commons available to everyone, extending everyone's capacity, can also function as a mechanism of unprecedented control. The information we generate about ourselves, every click, every search, every pattern of behavior, is increasingly being processed in real time by systems that can model our psychology with a precision no previous civilization could have imagined. What looks like a cognitive commons from one angle looks like a surveillance apparatus from another. The people who control the algorithms routing attention, deciding what billions of people see, feel, fear, desire, hold a form of power that no emperor, no pope, no party has ever held before. The critical question, the one that may determine the character of the eighth civilization, is this: who controls the information architecture? Earlier civilizations were defined by who controlled energy. Irrigation systems, bronze, iron, coal, oil. Control the energy source, and you control the civilization. The eighth civilization may be defined by who controls information processing, who decides what the algorithm amplifies, what it suppresses, what stories it tells the billions of people whose attention passes through it every day. Here's what the historians we've been reading tonight would recognize immediately. This question of information control is not new. It is the same question that was answered by the priestly classes of Sumer, the scriptoria of medieval Europe, the presses of the Reformation. In every civilization, the question of who controls the story is ultimately the question of who holds power. The answer has always shaped everything that followed. For the first time in civilizational history, the DNA of civilization isn't locked in stone tablets or shelved in monastery libraries. It's fluid, it's searchable. It can be backed up, forked, remixed, and it can be erased. What we do with that changes everything. And this brings us, finally, to a question that makes most people uncomfortable, but that the pattern we've been tracing tonight makes almost impossible to avoid. Are there people who already know what we've been discussing? Who have known for a long time? And if so, what are they doing about it? Here's the thing about conspiracy theories, and I want to say this carefully, because the reality is both more mundane and more unsettling than any single mastermind. The question isn't whether someone planned all of this. The question is why power always concentrates during civilizational transitions, and it has, every single time, in every single civilization we've looked at tonight, not because of a conspiracy, because of a pattern. Let me show you what I mean. In every civilization we've traced, there have been small groups whose primary function was the preservation and transmission of specialized knowledge across periods of disruption. The Brahmin priestly class in the Vedic civilization, the temple scribes of Egypt, the mystery schools of Greece Pythagoras' brotherhood, the Eleusinian mysteries that initiated people like Plato and Sophocles into something that was not shared with the general public, China's inner alchemy traditions, and the networks of Confucian scholars who maintained institutional continuity across the chaos of dynastic collapse. They weren't keeping secrets to be sinister. They were keeping secrets for the same reason a surgeon doesn't teach surgery on YouTube, because some knowledge is genuinely dangerous when transmitted without context, and some traditions are genuinely fragile when exposed to forces that don't understand what they're preserving. Here's what's strange about this, and this is where the pattern becomes genuinely interesting. The modern world has equivalents. They just wear different clothes. Davos, the World Economic Forum, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group, the various networks of foundation money, academic prestige, and institutional access that connect the 1,000 or so people who actually make the decisions that shape the lives of 8 billion others. These are real. They exist. They do, in fact, run simulations of pandemics, of financial collapses, of climate crises years before those crises arrive. They speak, in their internal documents, in a vocabulary that sounds remarkably like Spengler and Toynbee with spreadsheets. Klaus Schwab's Great Reset, however you evaluate it politically, from whatever position on the spectrum is, in structural terms, exactly what it claims to be: a serious attempt by people with access to enormous resources and institutional influence to think carefully about how to manage a civilizational transition. They call it a reset. Toynbee would have called it an interregnum management strategy. Now here's where I want to be very precise, because this is where the pattern gets more interesting than any mastermind theory could be. None of that means there is a mastermind. None of that means there is a coordinated plan to enslave humanity or eliminate most of the world's population, or any of the more baroque theories that circulate in the darker corners of the internet. Those theories are, in the historical record, almost always wrong. The pattern doesn't require a mastermind. It requires only what it has always had: small groups of people with more information, more resources, and more long-term planning capacity than everyone else, making decisions in their own interests while genuinely believing, sometimes correctly, sometimes not, that their interests and humanity's interests align. That is not a conspiracy. That is a structural feature of every civilization that has ever existed. The question that Toynbee was really asking, the uncomfortable one, the one that doesn't have a satisfying answer, is this: when the creative minority that built a civilization transforms into a dominant minority that rules by force rather than inspiration, are the people in that dominant minority aware of the transformation? Do they know what they have become? The historical record suggests usually not. The Roman Senate, in its terminal phase, still believed it was governing in the interest of the Republic. The medieval church, as it burned heretics and sold indulgences, still believed it was serving God. The British East India Company, as it extracted wealth from a subcontinent it was impoverishing, still believed it was bringing civilization to the uncivilized. The dominant minority rarely sees itself as the dominant minority. It sees itself as the responsible caretaker of what civilization has built. So, are the people gathering in Davos and at similar forums wise guardians trying to shepherd us through a dangerous turning of the wheel? Are they narrow elites trying to crystallize their advantages into the bones of the next civilization before the rest of humanity realizes the transition is underway? Or are they, and this is Toynbee's answer, and I think it's the most honest one, simply another expression of the same ancient pattern: small groups hoarding and transmitting specialized knowledge, hoping to survive the storm and shape what comes after? We don't know. We can't know from where we're standing, but the asymmetry is real, and it is ancient. What we do know, what the pattern says unambiguously, is that the people who shape the 8th civilization will not necessarily be the most powerful people in the 7th. They will be the people who are doing the work right now, that looks from the outside like just doing their work. The people laying down fragments of something new in the dark, not because they know where it leads, but because it seems worth doing. They always are. And that brings us, at last, to the question that may be the most important one of the night. Not what the 8th civilization will be, but who you are in relation to it. We've travelled a long way tonight. 5,000 years of civilizational history, 7 rises, 7 collapses, 7 interregnums in which the ruins of one civilization provided the material for the next. 7 times the pattern repeated, not perfectly, not mechanically, but with enough consistency that the thinkers who looked carefully at it couldn't shake the feeling that they were reading something that wanted to be read. Here's the thing. At the end of all of this, the thing that I keep coming back to, and that I think is the most honest conclusion the pattern supports: you are not watching this happen from the outside. Every person alive on this planet right now, every single one of us, is a living thread in this transition. The choices being made quietly everywhere, in server rooms and research labs, and on personal screens like the one you're listening on right now. Those choices are the civilizational DNA being laid down in this moment. Not by emperors, not by institutions, by the aggregate of billions of small decisions about what to believe, what to create, what to preserve, what to pass on. Brother Ionas didn't know he was preserving a civilization. He was just copying Virgil in a cold stone scriptorium because it seemed worth doing. The early Christians didn't know they were building the animating myth of the next 1,000 years of Western history. They were just writing letters to each other about the things that mattered. That is always how it begins. That is always how it has begun. not with a plan, with people who couldn't stop caring about something. And here I want to speak directly to the different people who are listening tonight, because the pattern assigns a role to everyone, not just to the young builders, not just to the powerful and influential, to everyone. If you are young, if you are 16 years old in a room somewhere, or 23 or 30, and you feel the weight of inheriting a world in transition, you are the builders. You are the people who will decide, through 10,000 small choices, what the next civilization keeps and what it abandons. Your generation will not remember a world before the digital transition, before the civilizational disruption, before the fourth turning arrived. That isn't a disadvantage. It's a qualification. The people who built Athens didn't mourn the Bronze Age. The people who built the Renaissance didn't long to be living in medieval feudalism. They built forward, with the materials they had, towards something they could only partly see. You are already building, even when it doesn't feel that way. If you are in the middle years, 40, 50, 60, you are the hinge generation, the generation that carries knowledge from one world into the next. You were formed by the institutions of the seventh civilization in its autumn. You watched the unraveling arrive. And, quote, you are living through the crisis in real time. You know, in your body, what the world felt like before, and you can see what it is becoming. That living knowledge, that capacity to hold two worlds simultaneously, to translate between them is not a burden. It is exactly what every interregnum has needed. The people who kept the libraries open, the people who maintained the roads when the empire stopped paying for maintenance, the people who held institutions together past the point where holding them together made obvious sense because they understood what would be lost if they let go. Your institutional memory matters more than you know. And for those of you who have lived long enough to watch this arc unfold across decades, who remember what the world felt like before this turning began, who were young during the post-war high, who watched the awakening arrive in the 1960s, who lived through the unraveling and are now in the midst of the crisis, your memory is not a burden. It is the most valuable thing in an interregnum. You are the archive. You are the monastery. Just as Brother Iona's in that cold scriptorium in Bobbio, just doing his work, keeping something alive because it seemed worth keeping alive, you, by remembering what came before, by holding the thread of continuity across the break, are performing one of the most essential functions a civilization in transition requires. The people who know what things were like before the storm are not living in the past. They are the living link between the civilization that is ending and the civilization that is beginning. They are the living proof that something was built and that it had value and that some of it should survive. You are the monastery. There is a feeling that many of us carry, the feeling that gave us the title of tonight's video. That sense of being present at a collapse, of watching the old world dying without being able to see clearly what is being born. That feeling is real. The thing it describes is real. The pattern confirms it. But here is what else the pattern confirms. This feeling is not new. Every person who has ever lived through a civilizational transition has felt it. Every single one. The people alive in Rome in 450 AD felt it. The people alive in Europe during the Black Death felt it. The people alive in any of the interregnums we've traced tonight, the gaps between what was and what came next, they felt exactly what you are feeling. And something new is always born from it. Not despite the feeling, because of it. Here is what I want to leave you with as you drift off tonight. The civilization you are living in is changing. That is true. The pattern says it. Spengler said it. Toynbee said it. Strauss and Howe said it. And the eighth civilization, whatever it turns out to be, is being built right now, in ways none of us can fully see. But you are not a bystander. You were never a bystander. You, lying awake tonight with the news running somewhere in the back of your mind, with the worry about the economy, about the institutions that used to feel solid, about the world your children or grandchildren will inherit. You are carrying what every person who has ever lived through a civilizational transition has carried. The civilizational anxiety, the insomnia of the interregnum, the inability to settle, because something fundamental really is shifting. That feeling is not a symptom of personal failure. It is not neurosis. It is not weakness. Of quote, it is the feeling of being alive at a moment of civilizational consequence. 7 times before, people lay awake in the dark with exactly that feeling, and from their restlessness, from their inability to accept the dying of one world and their uncertainty about what would replace it, something new was built. Something that eventually, centuries later, became the world that other people would take for granted. You are already part of that, so let the weight of the world rest where it belongs tonight in the pattern, in the 7 that came before, in the long, slow, magnificent rhythm of human civilizational time, which has never ended in nothing, which has always found a way to build something from the ruins of something else, which has every single time surprised everyone who thought they could see where it was going. The forest grows back. It always has. So settle in. Get comfortable, if you haven't already. Let this be the last thought that carries you tonight. You are not living through the end of the story. You are living through one of its oldest, most recurring passages. And what comes next, whatever it is, will have your fingerprints on it. Sleep well.